Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today is 21st of April 2024. We are going to hear about the book Gender Identity, Lies and Dangers by Laura Lecuona, and it's discussed by Laura Lecuona and Sheila Jeffries. Radical Feminist Perspectives is a women-only webinar, a series of webinars run by radical feminists whose voices have been silenced and cancelled in universities, schools and the media. Frustrated we can't share what we know in these places, we're offering this online series of webinars here. Enjoy. So thank you very much, Sheila and Laura, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Jo. Hello, sisters. I'm absolutely delighted today to be able to introduce Laura Lecuona's wonderful book, Gender Identity, Lies and Dangers. And I'm ever so grateful that Laura is here with us. It is apparently 3 o'clock in the morning in Mexico. So that's pretty amazing. Now, this book was first published in Mexico in 2023, and there's a little whole story around its publication, which we will have later. This is the first English edition, and it was published by the feminist press Spinifex in Australia in 2024. So first of all, let me introduce Laura. Laura Lecuona studied philosophy at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico and an editor and translator, specializing in memoirs, young adult fiction, philosophy and social sciences. She has held editorial coordination positions at PAIDOS, Fondo de Cultura Económica, and Ediciones SM. As a popularizer of feminism, she's a regular lecturer and writer. In the Spanish-speaking world, she's one of the main referents of the feminist criticism of the doctrine of gender identity, and we'll hear more later about her adventures in all of that. Now, she's Mexico's country contact for Women's Declaration International and the author of Gender Identity, Lies and Dangers. So I'm going to talk first a bit about my reactions to the book before I get Laura to talk about it. Increasingly, books that are critical of the theory and practice of transgenderism or men impersonating women are being published in the UK and the US, which is terrific. And this is all very recent, in fact, just in the last 3 years. And it's a reaction to the feminist activism that's developed against this men's rights movement. What distinguishes Laura's book is that it is based in a strong and clear radical feminism. The only other really recent book that is so founded in radical feminism is that of Janice Raymond, which is also from Spinifex. There are other books that are critical, but they are by women who are completely new to the topic and to feminism, which is not the case in Laura's case. And several of the books focus specifically on the transgendering of children, because this has caused the most immediate horror amongst many women who are becoming aware of the problem of transgenderism for the first time. Laura's book, though, looks at the whole issue, the history, the theory, the politics, and the practice. Now, the book contains much that is new and fascinating even to seasoned activists in this struggle. The first chapter on the concept of gender, for instance, contains a section very interesting to me. Laura took the trouble to look at the way in which the word gender was adopted by feminists who worked in the world of the UN and women's rights. She shows how they transformed the possibilities of women's rights by pushing that word through in place of the word sex in the 1990s. And it's fascinating stuff. And though I was broadly aware of what happened because I was involved in all this work at the time, I didn't know the detail. And it's really good that Laura put that in, and nobody else has done that. What most impressed me when I read the book is the eloquence and clarity of the writing. In the chapter on how transgenderism has been theorized and justified, she writes about complex ideas in the most pellucidly clear way, so that reading about them is effortless. That's very unusual. It's very unusual to be able to read a lovely book that just carries you along. So can I have the first slide, Joe?
Yeah.
Next one. Thank you. Now, this is just a couple of short sentences, and you might think, why have I shown you the opening of just one chapter, which is the chapter on the transgender child? I put it there because I just think it's so lovely and clear, and well, it's wonderful to have such an opening of a chapter and such strength and clarity of thought. She says, the last decade to see the invention of a category, the transgender child. In practice, this is tantamount to pathologizing completely normal behavior in perfectly healthy children. Spot on. So that's what I really like. And this is just an illustration of the way that the book unfolds. Now, the last decade, Laura's knowledge is encyclopedic, and it covers the now as well as history. So there's so much in here. She's not only read the academic literature, but she's steeped in the work of the feminist activists working now to defeat transgenderism, and lots of the interesting examples come from that work. Now, another thing that I really like is that Laura writes about transgenderism from the perspective of the Spanish-speaking world and from Mexico. There's a whole chapter on pronouns, which I've not seen anyone else cover nearly as well. And it's a marvelous chapter. It explains what's been going on with the Spanish language, and that is really fascinating. I mean, Laura explains how in English there's been this ridiculous adoption of their, by people who wish to conceal their biological sex, pretty ridiculous stuff. So there's been a massacre of the English language by these activists, and it's going to take some time to take the English language back from the horrors that they have been performing on it. But it's very interesting to look at what's happened in Spanish, and I hadn't thought of that. I was aware that there must be problems happening in different languages around the world. So could we have the next slide, Joe? Thanks. So what she says here, that in Spanish, a language in which they does have grammatical gender, as in ellos masculine and ellas feminine, the difficulty has been solved by inventing neutral pronouns, some of which them unpronounceable. I can't pronounce them. There's no way I'm going to try to pronounce them. So that's my problem in sort of reading this out. For example, something, something, and something, with which nouns and adjectives must be made to agree by giving them the corresponding endings in, gosh knows how to pronounce any of them either. So that, but that's absolutely fascinating. And that must be happening in different languages around the world as these activists put on pressure and try to massacre languages just about everywhere. I mean, it really is pretty extraordinary stuff. But this is a lovely example of what's going on. And there's many lovely examples like this in here. Now, of course, the absurdity of pronouns, the trans activist pronouns, plus the difficulty of the word gender itself are manifesting differently in different languages, because, of course, gender in some languages does not exist as a word and so on. So enormous confusion is being created in language. I mean, the effect on culture, politics, language of what these men are doing is just extraordinary in its scope and in its profundity and the way it's getting at the basis of culture and the way we communicate and so on. Now, Laura writes, I think, in a way that's really, really lovely in this chapter about the ways in which pronouns are presently being imposed upon people. And she explains, for instance, that though she is sometimes required to enter churches in Mexico, she does not take part in any of the ceremonies because she is not a believer. Well, that possibility is apparently not really allowed to us in relation to transgenderism because the pressure is hugely stronger. So she gives another great example of what's happening. She gives an example which is a wonderful comparator to what's happening with pronouns. She says that she explains that female newsreaders in Afghanistan, once Afghanistan was taken back into the control of the extreme patriarchs, they were forced to be entirely covered, although at the very beginning, because women had experienced 20 years of much more equal possibilities, some of the women tried to not wear veils, but within a very short time, they had to be covered. So the parallels, sorry, let's have the third slide, the next slide, so I can read it. She says that the parallels with the subject of this book are obvious. Several examples show how the Ministry for the Propagation of Pronouns and Prevention of Hate Crime, which I like as a phrase, imposes its will. The same female presenters who wore the veil under protest are like feminists who reluctantly agree to say she to a man so that they will not be banned from social media or have their publishing contract cancelled. So I really like that that example and that comparison. I like to think that it's getting a little bit better now and that women are finding it easier to actually use the correct pronouns for men. But I fear that a great deal of this is still going on. And as Laura explains to us later in her book, many of the other books on this issue, the women have agreed, the authors have agreed to use the word she. So they have not been able to resist being veiled, as it were. Can we have the next slide? And this is a nice comparison as well. She says both groups, that is the gender identity activists and the Afghan ministry, accuse women of causing, through their actions, what may happen to others, whether they are supposed to provoke uncontrollable sexual desire by wearing their heads uncovered, or triggering some by not calling him mom. Both are about making us responsible for someone else's behavior and emotional well-being. It's a lovely example, and there are many lovely examples in the book which really sort of encompass beautifully the problem that we have. So can we go on now to the questions? So if we'll take that slide down. Okay. Now I'm going to ask Laura some questions about the book so that we can get a sense from her of exactly what's in there. Now, first of all, Laura, how did you come to write the book? I believe the first publisher wouldn't publish in the end. So can you explain to us what happened and what was the situation in Mexico at the time that you wrote the book?
Of course, Sheila, thank you very much for this introduction and for reading my book and writing that beautiful endorsement. And thank you, everybody, for being here. I'll tell you now how I came to write this book. In February 2022, the managing editor of an important Mexican publishing house, Siglo XXI, which means 21st century, invited me to write it. It was intended for a general readership. The idea was for it to serve as an introduction to the debate around transgenderism and gender identity, presenting the different sides of the discussion so as to promote a healthy public conversation, which was so urgent even 2 years ago. In Mexico, we have self-ID in 20 states out of 32, laws against so-called conversion therapies in 13 states. In March 2022, the Supreme Court deemed unconstitutional the requirement of being at least 18 years old to have your sex changed in your documents, no questions asked. The difference with the UK and Spain is these trans laws have passed behind people's backs. There hasn't been a public discussion, not a single forum on the Chamber of Deputies or the Senate about gender identity, not a TV show presenting the different sides of the debate, not one university conference which allows for a different view from the official one, that is the idea that people have a gender identity and trans women are women and there are lesbians with penises and there's such a thing as a trans kid. While I was writing the book, several things happened in Mexico which went straight into it as examples and show that in this country, we have media and institutions that are completely captured by transgenderism via the Yogyakarta Principles, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, and young people who claim to have a transgender identity and happen to be children or nephews of powerful journalists and people in the media and public office. This last one thing, by the way, is a huge influence which we don't talk enough about. These media personalities having children who claim to be transgender. These are, I'm sure, a powerful influence in transgenderism and the capture of institutions. So I was very happy to write the book and hoped that it would foster an urgent debate. Since 2017, when I wrote a short piece about the transgendering of children and was consequently targeted by gender identity activists, I had been studying the subject and reading about it in a very passionate way. Also, subject matter aside, after so many years of being an editor myself, I was very happy to be, for the second time around, on the other side of the desk, so to say, not as the editor of a book, but as a writer. When I studied philosophy, I hadn't planned on being an editor. Life took me there in a somewhat random way. This doesn't mean I don't like it. In fact, I love being an editor and a translator. But as a college student, I had other aspirations. Writing a sturdy book was something much nearer to my real interests in life. Siglo XXI's proposal was a great opportunity I could not turn down. I must say, I enjoyed the process of writing the book very much, and I am proud of having managed to write this 400 pages long book in 8 months, even though all the while I had to keep working as an independent editor and translator in order to pay the rent. But then again, I had been writing it in a sense since 2017. Those were 5 years of delving deep into the subject and being active in the public discussion around it. That means in social media and feminist circles. Since the beginning, with Siglo XXI, presenting the book at the Guadalajara Book Fair, which is the largest and most important book fair in Latin America, was part of the plan. My editor was very happy with the book. Looking through all the emails just this afternoon, I found comments like this one from him. "We will strongly promote your book, you'll see. Each day that passes, I confirm that a book is terribly needed that explains to the public what is happening around gender identity and helps them have a critical view on the matter." But then something happened and there was a change of plans. Nobody knew I was writing this book, but when the official program of the Guadalajara Book Fair came out and the date of the presentation and title of the book were announced, the usual harassers, particularly one male influencer who claims to be a woman and whose real name is Ernesto Raimundo, started blackmailing the fair. which in turn pressured the publishing house to do something and stop it. There were even threats of putting Siglo XXI's stand on fire if they presented my book there. So first, the presentation was cancelled due to the distinctive transactivist violent harassment, and then the publication itself was cancelled. That's how my book came to be an example worthy of my book, where I speak about what happened to Australian philosopher Holly Lawford Smith when Oxford University Press published her book, Gender Critical Feminism, and it received 2 open letters from deeply concerned groups of people questioning the decision to publish it. As I write in my book, which I quote from, the signatories of the letters, authors, reviewers, translators, and readers who claimed to be associated with Oxford University Press and its reputation, set themselves up as an editorial board and laid out a series of requirements, including the due diligence of consultation with experts in transgender studies, and if it went ahead with publication, proposed some steps for accountability to compensate for the damage their reckless act might cause, such as donating a portion of the book's profits to supporting transgender rights organizations and other measures, always in consultation with transgender rights activists and transgender scholars. Imagine that. The publisher, Oxford University Press, responded to this blackmail in a way that should be an example to all media outlets that allow themselves to be intimidated by transactivist demands for censorship. Essentially, what did Oxford University Press do? They went ahead with the publication. Another case I mentioned in the book, an especially sad one, is that of Rachel Rooney, who was viciously attacked for writing a picture book for 3, 4, and 5 years old kids, which states things as horrible as this quote: "Bodies are different, children are too." Or, "You're born in your body, you don't have a spare, so love it, hug it, treat it with care." These messages seemed unacceptable to transactivists and trans allies who were quick to accuse their author of making terrorist propaganda, being a transphobe, and having a hateful worldview. The harassment towards Rachel Rooney was relentless, and she made this statement: "Due to sustained bullying received from within the children's publishing industry for speaking out on gender issues, I am withdrawing from public life as an author for the sake of my mental health. Although as an autistic woman and special needs teacher, I will continue to speak out for autistic youth caught up in this shit show." Well, for me, it wasn't near as hard as for Rachel Rooney, but also I wasn't as lucky as Holly Lawford Smith, because Siglo XXI didn't follow the example set by Oxford University Press, and therefore my book wasn't launched by an established publisher. In the end, I self-published my book in Spanish. Being an editor, I knew which steps to take. And now it is in English, thanks to Renate Klein and Susan Hawthorne, I will always be grateful. Spinifex Press is a radical feminist independent publisher, which is a rare specimen and does a much needed work. Several of the books I read to write this one were published by them, and they have to be in any radical feminist library. Well, that's it, Sheila. That's my answer to your first question.
Thank you. Now, I'm so pleased that you have covered what's going on with publishing, because there really needs to be much more on this, because it's a huge horror for the academy and for publishing generally. I mean, what happened with my book, as probably women do know, is that it was due to be published by an academic press, which is Routledge, who's been publishing my work since 1985, in fact. And The book was absolutely set to go. It had been edited. I'd made all the changes that were required. This was penile imperialism. Everything was absolutely fine. They'd accepted the title, amazing. But just before it was due to be actually sent to be printed, I got communication from the press saying that they'd had their legal department look at it. I'm sure they don't do this for anything else. And I was required to make this sort of 50 changes or so, which were absolutely nonsense changes, where they said were basically afraid that somebody might sue if I quoted what they'd actually written in an academic article, all kinds of absolutely nonsense changes that they required. And I was reasonably heartbroken because, you know, I'd been with Routledge for a long time, but I decided that I could not at that stage give in to their absurd demands. So I got out of the contract, and that wasn't easy, but I got out of the contract and I sent it to Spinifex, of course. And I was very, very delighted to be published by Spinifex. But, you know, it's happened to so many of us, all of this stuff. And you're telling the story, and you've started telling the story. And so I'm really grateful for that, actually, because we need to have that information. I didn't know exactly what had happened to Rachel Moody, but it's truly, truly horrifying.
Yes,
okay. Yes. So let's move on now. So the question is, how was the book received in Mexico? What are your experiences in Mexico since the book came out last year?
Sure. Many women in sisterhood, because they knew I had been eventually turned down by Siglo XXI, and also because they were fully aware this is a very important women's rights issue, and some men, bought the book directly from me. I have sold 1,100 copies all by myself, which is good enough. But of course, if the book was available in bookstores, which it isn't, the numbers would be far greater. I have reached the very small portion of the public which follows me on Twitter, people who were already convinced of the harms of gender ideology. And that is great. I think the book can help them make stronger arguments and understand more deeply what is at stake and the origins of transgenderism and the radical feminist criticism. But the original aim was to reach a wider audience, and that hasn't been achieved. I have been willing to send it to a Spanish publisher, but I haven't found the time to do it. Maybe in the near future. And there's also the plan of making a Kindle version for it to sell on Amazon, but I haven't had the time. Maybe soon. I hope I can do it soon. There have been a couple of presentations in Mexico. When the book just came out in December 2022, I organized, by way of launching, a secret lesbian separatist posada. Posadas are a kind of Christmas Mexican party with piñatas and sparklers. That was fun and very special. And it was the first in-person feminist gathering I had been in a very long time, what with the COVID lockdowns and the constant threats from trans activists. This had to be secret, of course, because if a trans activist turned up there, that would have been, it would have to be cancelled for the sake of our safety. But other presentations have been online, as one with the Alianza de Redes Feministas Nacionales, National Feminist Networks Alliance. And once I read out loud the chapter on pronouns and language, and the beginning was a pronoun, in a Facebook Live with a feminist group from Oaxaca, Mujeres de la Sal. That was lovely. Also, there's one congressman in Mexico who has been vocal against transgenderism. I mentioned here in my book. Her name is Teresa Castel. She has been harassed, insulted, and accused by a couple of congressmen who claim to be women. She invited me to present the book in a small room in the Chamber of Deputies, and that was fine. So there have been some isolated events around the book. But Not a word from the mainstream press, which is no surprise. I sent the books to some journalists, one of them a woman who had been called a transphobe for interviewing Spanish philosopher Amelia Valcárcel. And she liked it, she liked the book, but apparently it never crossed her mind to invite me to talk about its topics in her popular talk show. I also sent it to an old friend of mine who has an important position in a public broadcaster, but she went total radio silence. She didn't even acknowledge to have received the book. Well, these are only two examples of how a feminist view on transgenderism is absent in the main discussion. The media might invite a right-wing man who is against gender ideology, as they call it, mixing it with feminism. They might invite him to a debate and then push the idea that the only possible views are the right-wing bigoted one and the left-wing progressive one. The feminist is a different view from both of these, but people don't know about it. There was another experience with the book, or since the book was published. The University College of Bioethicists, Colegio de Bioética from the National University of Mexico, had a Zoom gathering with me to talk about the book. I was invited by them and I was very happy about it. It was a very respectful meeting. Some of them agreed with my positions, some of them didn't. And then they invited me to a symposium they organized to talk about differences. They asked me to talk about differences between liberal feminism and radical feminism. And that was a great subject for me. I chose to exemplify some of those differences, talking about two arguments by Janice Raymond, one about surrogacy from her book, Women as Wombs, and one about the medical transgender empire, which she talks about in the Transsexual Empire. This was in the National Autonomous University of Mexico, where I studied, one of the institutions that have been almost completely captured in this country. The usual suspects harassed them, the bioethicists, and demanded an apology, and the Colegio de Bioética complied. Part of the apology consisted in organizing a series of conferences against transphobia in the university. And some people who saw it, I didn't see it, I didn't want to see it, but some people who saw it tell me my name was mentioned several times as an example of transphobia. What else? So these are some of the things that have happened since, Sheila.
Thanks, Laura. I can imagine that this was enormously stressful whilst all this was going on. I mean, and we mostly have been, women who've suffered this, have been sort of alone in suffering all of this harassment and distress. These are stories that need to come together as well. When everything is written, when we're over this, when we are over it. Okay. However, you have bravely carried on and you are here. So what I'd really like you to do is talk about what the book covers and how the book is organized.
Yes, of course. Well, there's an introduction, 6 chapters, a conclusion, and an afterword. The first chapter, which is called Gender, It's Complicated, traces the origins of the current uses of the term gender, as you mentioned, tells a bit of history, and lays the groundwork for further discussion around transgenderism. I explained the concept of gender identity and argue that replacing the verifiable material category of sex with the unprovable esoteric category of gender identity in laws and policies of secular countries is a serious anomaly, the most damaging consequences of which are set out in detail in the last 2 chapters of the book. In this first chapter, I also present proposals for a way out of certain dead ends around the word gender and a feminist project of Abolishing Gender. The second chapter, Three Theories about Transgenderism, also analyzes a concept, in this case, that of transsexuality, as well as the ideas that feed it and the context in which it arose. Historical background is provided, and the main positions, which I call medical, sexological, transgender, and radical feminist positions, are reviewed and schematized to show their weaknesses and strengths. All this helps to put into perspective the agreements and disagreements between the different models and to assess which of the three has the most revolutionary and subversive power. In one section, which is my favorite one in the whole book, I take a typical transgenderist allegation, which is a response to purportedly transphobic statements by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie in March 2017, and then calmly break it down and highlight its flaws. The same exercise of taking these transgenderist allegations and analyzing them can be repeated with all transgender discourses before allowing oneself to be blindsided by them. It shows that the radical feminist model offers the best explanation for why some people consider themselves transgender, and also the most far-reaching solution to their justified nonconformity, or gender nonconformity, as some call it. The onslaught of gender identity doctrine and militancy against women begins in language, with the imposition of invented meanings and a contrived use of words. A whole system of beliefs and the politics are imposed, which bring with them considerable social damage. In the third chapter, in the beginning was a pronoun, I argue that it is a very bad idea to give in to blackmail and use so-called preferred pronouns. When we talk about a man in the feminine, we are accepting the interlocutor's conclusion right off the bat. The statement, trans women are women, is false. And calling a man who claims to have a female gender identity a woman, or referring to him as she, makes us participate in that farce in a condescending way. We are told that it is basic empathy and that it costs us nothing, but this too is false. For this, truth is not at odds with compassion, and as my book demonstrates, there is a great deal at stake. It starts with using their pronouns, and it ends with ceding women's spaces and annihilating our sex-based rights. Chapter 4, the idea of the transgender child, recounts when, how, and why the concept was created and what political purposes it serves. This is very important. The transgender child was invented in order to serve some political purposes. When one understands this, it is outrageous. I argue, yes, of course, that trans kids do not exist, but I provide ample arguments and data to support the claim. This, of course, does not mean that there are no children and teenagers who wish to be the other sex or who, influenced by ideas floating around, say they are trans. But the interpretation favored in my book is very different from that given by the transgenderist and medical sexological models. To accept that there are trans kids is to accept a set of beliefs that are deeply sexist and to endorse a form of child abuse and the rejection of homosexuality. Numerous studies and life stories show that most children who believe they are trans grow up to be perfectly healthy and happy lesbians and gay men if they are left alone, rather than being corrected by changing their names and selling them the lie that they can transition to the other sex. Promoters of gender identity doctrine claim they question and want to end sexist roles and stereotypes that are instilled through socialization, but at the same time postulate that children who reject those stereotypes are a special category of people who were born with a gender identity that does not match their sex. That is, sexist roles are both a social construct and an innate trait. Posing the existence of transgender kids instrumentalizes children for their transgender cause, and far from celebrating difference, contributes to its destruction. To those who ask, and what is the problem? How does it affect you? The final chapters give 14 different answers with their respective examples, arguments, and evidence. Feminism and women-only spaces, toilets, shelters, prisons, are the main target of transgenderism. Indeed, feminism is a word devoid of meaning if we are unable to recognize female oppression because we pretend it's impossible to tell a woman from a man. Women-only spaces disappear the minute a man who claims he's a woman is admitted. But the need for these female enclaves does not fade away just because some theorists declared sex is irrelevant and many people are buying it. The doctrine of gender identity also wreaks havoc on children and young people, on some families, on our ability to study and deal with male violence, on measures to ensure equal representation in politics, on the gay and so-called LGBT community, on lesbians and the lesbian movement, and on some people who have made a gender transition, on the partners and wives of trans-identified people, on women's sport, on democracy, and so on and so forth. It is particularly damaging to freedom of speech and our aspirations to live in an open and fair society. The institutionalization of an anti-scientific and anti-women doctrine should not only concern feminists, but anyone interested in respect for human beings and their fundamental rights. That's the content of the book in short.
Yes, I think that summary is splendid of the effects upon women and why we should all care. It's really good, but also rather devastating to read, it's fair to say. Okay, now you say that your book is specifically radical feminist, which is great, because most of the books on this topic are definitely not. So I wonder if you could talk about the importance of this being a specifically radical feminist book and what that means.
Sure. The radical feminist view on transgenderism is the best, most straightforward and most logical explanation there is for the very different phenomena of some males claiming to be women and some females claiming to be men. These are very different phenomena. There's not the same, we cannot put these things together, even though transgenderism puts it together. But also for people who suffer what some call gender dysphoria, which, by the way, is not a feminist concept at all, radical feminism offers the best way out of that suffering. As Janice Raymond magnificently explained how many decades ago, almost, she wrote The Transsexual Empire in 1979. So it means 45 years ago, my goodness, imagine that. But of course, the most important books about transgenderism are from radical feminists. Gender Hurts by you, Sheila, published in 2014, and The Transsexual Empire by Janice Raymond, first published in 1979, and of which there is a second edition published in 1994. The main arguments against transgenderism and the explanations of the harms it entails are already there in those two fundamental books. I know many women, not necessarily feminists, arrive to similar conclusions. Not, of course, not the whole analysis, but they make they arrive to their big trends and reach it by themselves. They don't need to read radical feminists to come to the conclusion of there not being something as gender identity, and it being impossible to change sex, and this being harmful to women. They don't have to read radical feminism. But the sole fact that women can arrive to those conclusions by themselves proves that there's a lot of truth in our views. But the minute you start reading and researching seriously about it, you have to know who were the lesbian radical feminists who were already warning us about it so many years ago. When you read about it, if you want to write a book about transgenderism and feminism, you cannot ignore the fact that there's a book called Gender Hurts by Sheila Jeffries, and there's a book called The Transsexual Empire by Janice Raymond, and there's such a thing as a radical feminist perspective about these things. We feminists claim to be against female erasure, but another and very pervasive form of this erasure is ignoring the work of women who came before us and thought an awful lot about it. I think it is an act of elementary justice to acknowledge them. In fact, now that in some countries more and more people wake up to the fact that transgenderism is hurtful and is a big fat lie, some who arrived to their gender critical views a couple of months ago are bragging about being some kind of pioneers. It is arrogant, and it is an injustice not giving credit to whom it is due. So I don't know if this answers your question, Sheila.
No, I think it does. I think it does. And yes, I think the apparent disappearing of radical feminism from the history of the challenge to transgenderism is a very serious problem. So it's terrific that you paid so much attention to that in your book. I mean, it's really good. You've made a big step towards making sure that we're still in the history, and that's great. Now, and we may have covered this, and there may not be much more to say, but I must say that I really liked the chapter in your book, which is on the history of ideas about transgenderism, because you write about it with such clarity. I mean, in theory, you could get mired down in these ideas, but you're really, really, really clear about it. And I wonder if you could give us an idea of some of the ideas you cover. And I think you have mentioned that there are 3 basic approaches. So you don't have to really talk about that. But if you could give a couple of examples of those ideas. I mean, you really talk very nicely about them.
Yes. This was indeed a difficult chapter to write because I wanted to be absolutely clear. And in this effort, I myself found it clearer that this was very illuminating for me. Well, as I said, these approaches are what I call the medical sexological model, the transgenderist model, and the radical feminist model. Janice Raymond's The Transsexual Empire is a powerful critique to the view on transsexuality, which was the origin of it all back in the 70s. She calls it the medical model. Some physicians were the ones who were pushing the idea of having to correct some bodies and the practice of operating on them in order to enforce sexual roles and inhibit disobedience. These doctors found important allies in sexologists, about whom you abundantly write in Anticlimax. The positions included in this model have in common their scientific pretensions, their faith in medical technology, and their search for a cause of transsexuality, as it was called back then, in the biology or the psychology of the individual, rather than, as radical feminists do, in a social or cultural context. Then there's the transgenderist model, which is the prevailing view today. Although trans activists claim to be fighting what they call the pathologization of the trans identity, they desperately need the medical sexological model. The idea of a transgender child is itself pathologizing, that is, deeming a perfectly normal trait in a child as something which needs medical treatment. And the idea of the transgender child is at the same time essential for the idea of transgenderism being an innate characteristic and not, for example, as you yourself so brilliantly proved, a paraphilia learned through porn consumption, for example. You make these claims in penal imperialism, which is a magnificent continuation of gender hurts. And I hope many of the women here read it. Well, some transgender activists claim to want to abolish sexist stereotypes, and of course they claim to be feminists. Nothing farther from the truth. They are in fact enshrining sexist stereotypes. Only radical feminists fight for an authentic abolition of femininity and masculinity, understood as the idea that people are born with some behavioral traits depending on their sex, and if they are women or men, and understood as the ideological basis for male supremacy. That is masculinity and femininity, the ideological basis for male supremacy. And only radical feminists fight against this. Without femininity and masculinity, there can be no innate gender identity, no gender impositions, and gender nonconformity, as they call it, simply disappears. So, of course, transgender activists need femininity and masculinity. Their whole ideology is based on the idea of there being these innate traits, which we feminists call femininity and masculinity. Then, when you view it schematically, it becomes clear that the medical sexological model almost always goes hand in hand with the transgenderist model. For example, both of them find very useful the concept of gender identity. Both of them are interested in maintaining the legal recognition of trans persons as the sex of their choice. Both of them need to stipulate the existence of transgender children. Both of them need to promote some medical procedures, misleadingly called sex change, gender transition, or sexual reassignment surgeries. So we don't have much time, but this is the main idea of this central chapter.
Thanks very much, Laura. I'm very pleased you said that, because we do have the problem that there are many women involved now in fighting against the transgendering of children and so on, who are not prepared to accept that femininity and masculinity are the basic building blocks of male supremacy and that they need to go, and are determined actually to keep feminine behaviors and appearance while trying to say that men should not do the same thing. Men shouldn't do femininity, but women have the right to it in some way. It's a real problem. So I'm very pleased that you made that clear. So as a last point, really, I have said all the way through that I really, really like the way you write. And I don't always find that to be the case with philosophers, if I may call you a philosopher, because you clearly are, because your writing is so easy to read and it makes complex subjects seem really simple. And your examples are great always. And often philosophers don't do much in the way of examples, but I think examples are crucial. So the question is, do you write this way on purpose?
No, let me, before answering you, let me tell you, Sheila, that when I wrote the book, being read by you seemed like a fantasy. total fantasy. And the fact that you liked the book is the best gift I could have. Really, really. This is amazing. But and now to answer your question, maybe there are some elements of style which are not something I do on purpose. No, it's the result of years of being an editor, years of reading very, very good writers. For example, British female novelists whom I love. I love reading Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters, and I don't know. And of course, I also read Spanish literature, but I have read a lot of good books, and something has sticked maybe. And but what I do on purpose something that is to try to be as clear as possible. And when I studied philosophy, my interest was in analytic philosophy, and this is not at all as the French philosophers I'm sure you have read and don't like as much as I don't like them. But analytic philosophers tend to be clearer, not absolutely clear, but this is a type of philosophy very based on logic. So that's the kind of philosophy I liked. And there's about this clarity of language, there's an anecdote I would like to relate. When I worked in Paidós, this is the publisher who in Argentina published your book. In Spanish it's called The Industrial Vagina, which in Spanish is called La Industria de la Vagina. Yes. Paidós also published Gender Trouble by Judith Butler. But I was the one who published it because we were doing this co-edition with the UNAM's University Program of Gender Studies. I didn't decide to publish that book, but I was its editor. So, and when I read it, I had to read it because I was the publisher. And a friend of mine was one of the translators, and she's a great translator. But when I read it, I thought I was the problem. Why don't I understand this? What's happening? And I thought that those years away from philosophy had ruined my capacity of understanding, or something had happened. And I was very sad. I must tell, I was very sad. I thought, my goodness, of course I'm not a philosopher. I won't ever be able to return to it because I don't know what has happened in those years, but my goodness, this is not for me. And finally, I don't know how, I came to the conclusion that the problem wasn't me. I'm gladly I discovered it wasn't me. And when I read in your autobiography, Sheila, trigger warning, this quote, I remembered how I felt back then. Let me quickly read this quote. In many places, the name women's studies was changed to gender studies so as not to look too feminist and postmodern and queer, to look not too feminist and postmodern and queer theory was employed to create new forms of language. This had the effect of making many women feel they must not be very bright because they had no idea what feminist academics such as Judith Butler were talking about. This did create a class divide between women. Some feminist research and writing came to resemble the use of Latin in church in the period before the Reformation, when the vast mass of the population could not read or understand the language. Latin was a form of control. The Feminist Academy began to move in this direction in the 1990s with the adoption of postmodern language and concepts, and was very far from being connected to the liberation of women. Rather, it made many women feel inadequate. And so I felt inadequate when I read this, but that was an influence in my aim to be as clear as possible.
Yes, well, you have certainly done that. And it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you about this book. which I can only very, very strongly recommend. I hope everybody got the information about how to get the book, and I think Susan put it into the chat about how you can get it from Spinifex. So yes, it's been absolutely delightful. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you everybody who's watching and listening.
Thank you, Sheila, and thank you, Joe, and everybody. This was amazing.